That evening, inside the brightly lit ballroom of an elite club in Bethesda, my father raised his glass in front of 150 guests. He looked at my younger brother Brandon with the kind of pride I had spent my entire childhood craving, then spoke into the microphone. My son is the pride of the Whitman family, the only successful child we have. I stood at the back of the room holding a glass of water I had not touched. In that moment, I heard something inside me break quietly and cleanly. Not because I was jealous of Brandon. I had long outgrown the age of fighting for my parents' attention. What hurt was the fact that after 32 years of living like a shadow, my father could still erase me so easily. If you have ever been treated by your own family as if you did not exist, comment 1. I want to know if anyone out there understands what it feels like to stand in a crowded room and still feel so alone, you can barely breathe. My name is Clara Whitman. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital. I have opened the chests of people on the edge of death, held their hearts in my hands, and fought minute by minute to bring them back to life. But in the eyes of my father, Richard Whitman, I had never been an achievement. I was only the daughter born into the wrong place in a family that believed sons were the ones meant to carry the name forward. That night was Brandon's engagement party. Everything had been arranged so perfectly it almost looked fake. The white tablecloths did not have a single crease. Cream roses filled every corner of the room. Crystal glasses touched lightly, making the sound of money and reputation. My mother Elaine moved back and forth with a strained smile, looking at me as if she were begging me not to ruin the evening. I had no intention of doing anything. I had not come to cause trouble, nor had I come to show off that I had become the very person my father once said did not need to go to college. I simply wore a modest dark blue dress, my Johns Hopkins graduation ring, and told myself I would congratulate Brandon, then leave. But life has moments that do not let you walk away that easily. When my father called Brandon his only successful child, I was about to turn around. I wanted to hold on to the last bit of dignity I had left. I wanted to walk out of that room before the whispers could follow me. But just as I set my glass down on the table, a woman in a white dress walked toward me. She was Natalie Hayes, Brandon's fiancée. She did not look at my face first. She looked at the ring on my hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you work at Johns Hopkins?" I looked at her, and for one brief second the past opened in front of me. 3 years ago, 2 in the morning. A young woman had been rushed into the operating room after a car accident, her chest crushed blood flooding the space around her heart, her chance of survival so fragile that no one on the surgical team dared to breathe too loudly. I remembered those eyes. Paler then. More terrified then. But they were still the same eyes. Natalie stepped closer, tears rising in her eyes. "Are you Dr. Clara Whitman?" And with that single question, every lie my family had built for years began to crack. I grew up in a 2-story house in Bethesda, Maryland, where everything looked so neat from the outside that no one would have guessed my family had cracks. The lawn was always green. The white fence was always repainted before summer. The neighbors thought we were the perfect family. But inside that house, there was an unwritten rule. Brandon was the future. I was just the extra part. When Brandon was only 7, my father opened a separate savings account for him. He called it his son's education fund. Every time he received a year-end bonus, he added more money to it, then patted Brandon on the head and said, "One day you're going to do something great." I stood nearby holding a stack of school papers covered in A grades, waiting for him to look at me too. But his eyes rarely traveled far from Brandon. When I was 10, I won my school's science fair with a model of the circulatory system made from plastic tubes and red food coloring. My teacher sent home an invitation for my parents to attend the award ceremony. My mother had planned to go, but Brandon had a baseball game that same day. My father said, "The whole family should support our son." So I accepted my award alone, looking down at the empty seats where my family should have been. That evening, I brought the certificate home. My mother taped it to the refrigerator for a few hours. By the next morning, it had disappeared behind Brandon's baseball practice schedule. I said nothing. Children learn silence very quickly when they realize the truth does not make adults change. My father was Richard Whitman, the chief financial officer of an insurance company in Washington, D.C. He believed in order, achievement, and reputation. To him, the world was divided into two kinds of people: those worth investing in, and those who should know their place. I learned my place very early. Brandon was driven to school by my father in his black Lexus. I took the bus. When Brandon struggled with math, my father hired a private tutor the following week. When I asked to join an advanced class, he said girls don't need that much schooling. It won't do them much good anyway. Brandon wanted to attend a summer sports camp, and my father wrote the check without hesitation. I wanted to buy a set of exam prep books, and he told me the public library was good enough for me. Every time I pushed back, my mother would place a hand on my shoulder and whisper, "Your father only wants what's best for you, Clara. He thinks girls shouldn't have to carry too much pressure." But I understood. That was not protection. It was a cage, wrapped in words that sounded gentle. I became a good student, as if my survival depended on it. Grades were the only place where I could breathe. I was top of my class, and my teachers called me one of the brightest students they had ever taught. But at the dinner table, every conversation still revolved around Brandon. If he scored 1 point in a baseball game, the whole family celebrated. If I received an invitation to a summer academic program, my father barely glanced at it before asking Brandon how practice had gone that day. There were nights when I lay in bed listening to my father laugh with Brandon in the living room, wondering what I had done wrong. Was I not obedient enough? Was I not talented enough? Or was it simply that I had been born as the wrong gender for the child my father wanted? That question followed me through my entire childhood, and by the time I turned 18, it was no longer a question. It had become the most painful answer of my life. In the spring of the year I turned 18, my college acceptance letter arrived on a lightly rainy afternoon. I still remember standing on the front porch for a long time, my fingers trembling, as I stared at the University of Maryland logo on the envelope. It was not the most luxurious school, and it was not the biggest dream I had ever imagined, but it was the first door I had opened by myself. I had received a partial scholarship. The amount was large enough to make me believe everything might actually become possible, but there was still a gap that an 18-year-old girl could not immediately cover on her own. I needed about $15,000 a year for the rest of tuition, books, and the most basic living expenses. For many families, that would have been a serious number to consider. For mine, it was not impossible. My father had just bought Brandon a new set of baseball equipment and was already talking about replacing his car by the end of the year. That evening, my mother made roast beef the dish she only cooked when something important was happening in the house. The smell of butter, onions, and mashed potatoes filled the kitchen. I sat at the dinner table, placing the letter beside my plate, trying to look calm, even though my heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I was afraid someone else might hear it. When my father sat down, I pushed the letter toward him. I got in, I said. They gave me a scholarship. I only need the family to help with the rest. I'll work part-time, I'll save money, I just need a little help to get started. My father picked up the letter. He did not read it carefully. He only looked at the top, saw the name of the school, then placed it beside his glass of wine. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a chill down my spine. Because I realized he had already decided his answer before I had even opened my mouth. That money isn't for you, he said. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? He cut into the meat on his plate slowly, as if he were discussing an office expense. Brandon is going to need that money. He still has to get into a good school, study something worthwhile, and support a family one day. You're different. I looked over at Brandon. He was only 14, his head lowered as he stared at his phone under the table. He heard everything, but he pretended not to. My mother sat across from me, both hands gripping her napkin, her eyes avoiding mine. I want a career too, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I want to study medicine. My father laughed. Not loudly, but enough to make my face burn. Medicine, Clara? Do you even understand what you're saying? Girls don't need that kind of degree. Finding a good husband is much more realistic. The room went silent. The sound of his knife and fork against the plate continued steadily cold and sharp. I thought my mother would say something. Just one sentence. That I deserved a chance. That I had worked so hard. That a daughter could need a future of her own, too. But my mother only looked at me with wet eyes, the kind of apologetic eyes that never saved anyone. I did not cry. Maybe because the pain went too deep too fast and had no time to become tears. I folded the letter carefully as if one wrong crease might tear my dream open even further. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, then said, I understand. My father nodded, satisfied that the conversation had ended the way he wanted. He did not know that in that moment something else ended too. The daughter who had once waited for him to see her went numb in that dining room. That night I did not sleep. I sat in front of my old laptop opening job listing, after job listing near campus, my hands still cold. Before midnight, I had sent out 3 applications. One to a breakfast diner, one to a library, and one to a weekend tutoring center. I did not know how I was going to survive. I did not know how long my body could endure it. But I knew one thing with perfect clarity. From that moment on, I would never ask my father for anything again. My first day at the University of Maryland did not feel like the opening scene of a new life. I had no parents dropping me off at the dorm, no boxes packed into the trunk of a family car, no one taking a picture of me in front of the campus gate and telling me they were proud. I arrived by bus dragging an old suitcase with a wheel that kept sticking. I had only a few $100s in my pocket and a work schedule so full that just looking at it made me tired. In the mornings, I worked at a small diner, 2 blocks from campus. My shift started at 5 when the sky was still dark and the pavement was wet with dew. I poured coffee for truck drivers, cleared plates of cold eggs, wiped syrup from sticky tables, then rushed to class with the smell of grease clinging to my hair. Some mornings I sat in biology lecture with my eyes burning from lack of sleep, but my hand kept taking notes because I knew that if I slipped even once, there would be no one behind me to catch me. In the afternoons, I worked at the library. I shelved books, checked library cards, fixed jammed printers, and studied organic chemistry between students, asking for research materials. At night, I tutored high school students in math, the same kind of tutoring my father had once said was unnecessary for me. I taught children whose parents sat outside in the hallway waiting for them. Every time I looked at those parents, I wondered what it must feel like to have someone invest in your future. If you ever had to raise yourself because no one chose to stand on your side, comment, I understand. Not to complain, but so people like us can know they are not alone. I lived that way for 4 years. 5 hours of sleep a night felt like a luxury. I studied in laundry rooms on buses and in the back corner of the library after the lights were turned off. I ate so many instant noodles that just smelling the seasoning made my throat feel dry. My only pair of sneakers started peeling apart during my sophomore year. I bought glue, pressed the sole under a stack of books overnight, then wore them to work again the next morning. I did not go home for Thanksgiving. I told my mother I had extra shifts, and that was true. But the bigger truth was that I could not bear the thought of sitting at that dinner table, listening to my father ask Brandon which school he wanted, what major he wanted, and what kind of doctor he wanted to become while I was counting every dollar for textbooks. Sometimes my mother texted to ask if I was okay. I always replied, I'm fine. It was the kindest lie I could give her. Once I had a fever close to 104 degrees, right before an anatomy exam. I curled up on my dorm bed watching my phone light up with a message from my mother. She had sent a picture of Brandon in his prom suit with the caption, "Your brother is really growing up." I stared at the photo, turned off the screen, swallowed 2 fever reducers, and opened my notes again. People who are not supported learn how to push themselves back onto their feet. On graduation day, I wore the cheapest rented black gown I could find and stood under the harsh sunlight on campus, searching the crowd for a familiar face, even though I already knew no one would be there. My mother texted that Brandon had an important baseball game, so the family could not come. I read the message before the ceremony, then slipped my phone into my pocket as if putting away a knife wound I had grown used to. When my name was called as valedictorian with honors, the applause came from strangers. One professor shook my hand and said, "Clara, you did this on your own." I smiled. But later in the parking lot after the ceremony, I sat alone in my old car and cried. Then I wiped my face, opened the envelope from medical school, and understood that the hardest part of the road had not even begun. I used to think that after college graduation, everything would become lighter. I was wrong. Medical school did not open before me like a bright doorway. It felt more like a long hallway with no visible end, where every step demanded payment in sleep health and the softest parts of myself. Johns Hopkins accepted me with a financial aid package large enough to keep me from giving up in the first year. The rest came from loans, small scholarships, side jobs, and calculations so careful that every dollar had a purpose. While other students called home to complain about being tired, I called the bank to ask about payment deadlines. I learned how to stretch 1 loaf of bread across 2 meals. But the deeper I went into medicine, the more I understood that I had not chosen this path only to prove something to my father. At first, maybe I had carried the anger of an 18-year-old girl who had been told that daughters did not need degrees. But then I met my first patients. I saw the trembling hands of a wife outside the emergency room. I heard a child begging the doctors to save his father. I watched a heart stop beating, then beat again. After that, anger was no longer what kept me standing. The meaning of the work did. 4 years of medical school passed like one long fever. 6 years of residency were even harsher. I slept on callroom chairs, ate rushed meals in elevators, and learned how to keep my voice calm when I was exhausted inside. There were surgeries that lasted until morning, and I would walk out of the operating room with numb legs. I chose cardiothoracic surgery, a specialty that made many people look at me and ask, "Are you sure?" They did not ask male doctors that question nearly as often, but I was used to it. I had spent my whole life hearing different versions of the same message. "Are you sure you can handle this?" And every time, I simply lowered my head and kept going. When I was 32, I became an attending surgeon at Johns Hopkins Hospital. My name appeared on research papers. I was invited to speak at conferences. Older doctors shook my hand after surgeries and told me they trusted me. That trust did not come from relatives. It did not come from my parents. I bought myself a Johns Hopkins graduation ring with my own savings. It was gold with a small face engraved with the school emblem. It was not too flashy, but to me it felt as heavy as a vow. Every time I removed it and placed it in the tray before surgery, I remembered the girl whose father had once told her that her future was not worth investing in. That girl had not disappeared. My family knew very little about that life. My mother knew I worked at a hospital, knew I was busy, knew I did not come home often. She did not ask too deeply. My father barely asked at all. On the rare occasions when my mother mentioned me, he would only say, "Is she still working at the hospital?" as if I were some distant employee he barely knew. Brandon, on the other hand, remained my father's favorite story. Brandon was studying medicine. Brandon was going to become a doctor. Brandon was the pride of the family. At first it hurt. Later it only made me tired. I had built a life that no longer needed their approval. But that did not mean the child inside me had stopped hoping that one day my father would look back and say, "Clara, you did well." Some wounds do not disappear simply because you become successful. I received my mother's call on a Tuesday night just after I got back to my apartment from a long surgery. Outside the window, Baltimore was covered in cold city lights. My wrists still carried the marks from my gloves. My mother's name appeared on the screen at 9. Sedemnized P. M. She rarely called that late, unless she wanted to say something my father could not hear. "Clara, are you busy?" Her voice was so low that I had to press the phone closer to my ear. "I just got home." "What's wrong, Mom?" She was silent for a few seconds, then said very softly, "Brandon is engaged." I set my salad container down. Brandon had once been my little brother before he became the symbol of everything I was never allowed to have. "Is that so?" I said. "Congratulations to him. Her name is Natalie Hayes. The family is hosting a party at Bethesda Country Club next Saturday night. Your father wants it to be big. Around 150 guests. Bethesda Country Club. That was where my father took clients to play golf, where he always tried to prove that the Whitman family belonged to the class he admired. A party there was not only meant to celebrate Brandon, it was a stage for my father to display the return on his investment. "Are you calling just to tell me?" I asked. "No." She hesitated. "I want you to come." I looked at my Johns Hopkins ring, lying beside the sink. Under the light, the small emblem on its face glowed like an old question. "Does Dad know you invited me?" Silence again. "Mom." "He knows," she said. "But he doesn't think we need to send you a formal invitation. Your family." Family. For Brandon, family meant being supported. For me, it usually meant being expected to understand, to behave, and to make myself smaller. "Clara," my mother continued, "if you come, I hope you won't talk about work. Your father doesn't want people to misunderstand and think the evening is about you." I closed my eyes. The sentence was not surprising, but it still hurt like someone pressing on a bruise that had never healed. "Are you asking me not to tell people I'm a doctor?" "That's not what I mean. It's just that Brandon is at an important stage. He's about to finish medical school. He has such a bright future ahead of him. Your father wants everyone to focus on him." "And what about me?" She did not answer right away. In that silence, I heard everything. "You only need to come as Brandon's sister," my mother whispered. "That's enough." I looked around my small apartment, at the medical books on the shelf, the white coat hanging over the chair, and the packed hospital schedule on the wall. I had built an entire life out of sweat and sleepless nights, yet, whenever I returned to my family, I was still expected to put it away. I almost said no. But the part of me that had once sat in that dining room at 18 and listened to my father say daughters did not need degrees suddenly wanted to see what would happen if I stopped disappearing. "Fine," I said. "I'll come." My mother exhaled in relief. "Thank you. And Clara, please wear something simple. Brandon is the main person that night." I looked at the ring on the counter, then slipped it back onto my right hand. "I understand," I said. But the truth was, for the first time in many years, I was no longer sure I wanted to understand. On Saturday night, I took an Uber to Bethesda Country Club. I did not want to drive myself. I did not want to hand my keys to a valet and hear someone ask what I did for a living where I lived, or why I had not been seen beside the Whitman family in so long. Some questions sound ordinary, but for me, each one could pull open an old wound. The car stopped in front of the club entrance. At 10 minutes to 7, the white building appeared beneath the golden lights, elegant and cold like a painting framed too carefully. Tall windows reflected people in suits, evening gowns, and glittering jewelry. I wore a dark blue silk dress, simple just as my mother had asked. No large necklace. No eye-catching earrings. Nothing that could make anyone think I was trying to steal Brandon's spotlight. Only my Johns Hopkins ring on my right hand. I had thought about taking it off, but in the end I kept it on. At the entrance, a man in a black blazer stood beside the guest list. He asked for my name, then checked once twice. The smile on his face slowly thinned. "I'm sorry, I don't see your name here." I stood still for a few seconds. Some insults still make you go cold even when you saw them coming. "I'm Brandon Whitman's sister," I said. He looked confused. "Could you call the event organizer for me, please?" I called my mother. She appeared moments later in a silver dress, her lips smiling while her eyes looked panicked. "She's with me," she said quickly. "She's family." Family. I walked through a door that had not even carried my name on paper. Inside the ballroom was almost painfully bright. Crystal chandeliers spilled light over round tables covered in white cloth. Cream roses stood in tall vases. A string quartet played soft classical music. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and completely unfamiliar. My father stood near the entrance, shaking hands, with guests like a politician. When he saw me, his smile froze for less than a second. Then he nodded. That was all. "Nucleara, you made it." No hug. No introduction. A moment later, the man beside him asked Richard, "Who is she?" My father answered very quickly. "Just a relative." I heard every word. It was not loud, but it went straight to the deepest place inside me, the place that still held every memory of him choosing Brandon in front of me. I did not turn back to confront him. I simply walked toward the drink station, keeping my back straight the way I did in the operating room when everything became dangerous. Behind me, my father's laughter continued, as if he had not just cut his daughter out of the family with one sentence. At the bar, I ordered sparkling water with a slice of lemon. Brandon stood in the middle of a group of young guests laughing loudly, one hand resting lightly around Natalie's waist. My younger brother looked perfect in his navy suit. From a distance, no one would have guessed how many lies had been stitched into that image. My mother passed by me and stopped quickly. "Are you all right?" I looked at her. "Was my name on the guest list, Mom?" Her face went pale. "Your father said there was no need." "Because you're family." I let out a small laugh. "How strange." "I'm family, but you had to lead me inside." She lowered her eyes, then hurried away. I remained there alone, my hand tightening around the cold glass of water. That night, amid the lights and music, I realized that some old wounds only need the right setting to start bleeding again. And my father had not even said the worst thing yet. At exactly 8 o'clock, the music softened. The host stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone lightly. Glasses were set down. And my father, Richard Whitman, walked up to polite applause from people who still believed he was a respectable man. He held a glass of champagne in his left hand. The expensive watch on his wrist caught the chandelier light. I stood near the back of the room beside a window overlooking the dark golf course. I had promised myself that I would listen to the speech, congratulate Brandon once, then leave. My father smiled at the crowd. It was the smile he used whenever he needed to prove that the Whitman family was perfect. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said. "This is a very special evening for our family. We are here to celebrate Brandon and Natalie, two wonderful young people preparing to begin a new chapter of their lives." Applause filled the room. Brandon stood near the stage, his chest slightly lifted, his face bright with the pleasure of being seen. Natalie stood beside him in an ivory white dress. She was smiling, but there was something distant in her eyes. My father continued. "Brandon has always been my greatest pride. Ever since he was young, he showed determination and leadership. We invested in him, believed in him, and tonight, seeing him stand here, I know every sacrifice was worth it." I heard the word invested, and my hand tightened around my glass without meaning to. I remembered the college acceptance letter he had placed beside his wine years ago. I remembered him saying that money was not for me. I remembered my shoes peeling apart the 5 o'clock shifts the mornings when I ran to class smelling like diner grease. My father stood on that stage talking about sacrifice, as if he knew what sacrifice meant. Then he said it. Brandon is the pride of the Whitman family, the only successful child we have. The room applauded. I did not hear the applause as sound. I heard it as a door slamming shut. 150 people were looking at Brandon, believing the story my father had told them while I stood in the back, erased from my own bloodline. No one knew who the woman in the blue dress was. And the worst part was that my father knew. He knew I was there. A woman near me leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Richard has a daughter." The man answered softly, "I thought they only had one son." I set my glass of water down on the table. In that moment, I did not feel angry. I only felt tired. Tired, because if I stayed in that room any longer, I would become that little girl again, waiting for her father to turn around and see her. I turned toward the door. But before I could take a step, someone called softly behind me. "Excuse me." I turned back. Natalie was standing a few steps away. Her eyes were fixed on my right hand where my Johns Hopkins ring was reflecting the light. She stepped closer, her voice low with confusion. "That ring? Did you go to Johns Hopkins?" I looked at her, and a strange feeling moved down my spine. It was as if the past had just knocked on the door. "Yes," I said. "I did." Natalie lifted a hand to her chest, her breathing suddenly becoming shallow. "Do you work at the hospital?" Across the room, my father was still saying something about Brandon's future. But in front of me, this woman was looking at the ring as if it were a missing piece of her life. "I work at Johns Hopkins Hospital," I replied. Natalia's face went pale. "What is your name?" I was silent for one beat, then said Clara Whitman. Her eyes widened. "No way," she whispered. "Are you doctor?" "Clara Whitman." Natalie's question left me standing still for a few seconds. Across the room, my father's voice continued through the microphone, steady and confident, as if the world had always belonged in his hands. But in the small space between Natalie and me, every other sound suddenly faded. All I could see were her eyes. Eyes trembling, with a memory I had never forgotten either. "Yes," I said slowly. "Im Doktor." Clara Whitman. Natalie lifted one hand to cover her mouth. The soft color on her lips almost disappeared as the blood drained from her face. She looked at me as if she were seeing someone return from the past, someone who was supposed to exist only in a hospital room in the haze of pain medication, in the stories her family told after an accident she was never supposed to survive. 3 years ago, she whispered. The accident on I-95. A truck ran a red light. I nodded. The image of that night came back too clearly. 14 inches the morning. The emergency room doors flying open. The sharp sound of stretcher wheels racing across the floor. A 26-year-old woman with her chest crushed, her blood pressure dropping fast, her heartbeat chaotic like a door about to close forever. "I remember," I said. Natalie started crying before I could say anything else. Not loudly. The tears simply spilled out fast and silent, making the flawless makeup of a future bride begin to blur. She took my hand in both of hers and held it tightly, as if she were afraid. I might disappear if she let go. "You saved me," she said. "They told me you operated on me for 7 hours. They told me my heart almost stopped twice. My mother said you came out of the operating room with red eyes from exhaustion, but you still told her I had a chance." My throat tightened. I had saved many people. I remembered many faces. But not every patient returned to my life like this. Especially not at a party where my father had just erased me from the family. If you are listening to this, and you have ever had a truth hidden from you, for too long, comment, "Truth," because sometimes the truth does not need anyone to drag it out. It walks into the room on its own and makes everyone go silent. Brandon appeared beside Natalie almost immediately. The smile on my brother's face had gone stiff. He looked at Natalie's hands holding mine, then looked at me as if I had committed some kind of crime. "What's going on?" Brandon asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Are you okay?" Natalie turned to him. "Brandon, why didn't you tell me your sister is a heart surgeon?" The question fell between us, like a glass dropped to the floor before it had time to shatter. Brandon blinked. For one brief second, I saw panic pass across his face. Then he quickly pulled his familiar calm expression back into place. "Oh, Clara works at the hospital," he said. "I told you that." "No." Natalie shook her head. "You told me she had an administrative job." I said nothing. I only looked at Brandon. Just like years ago at the dinner table when my father said the money for school was not meant for me, he was standing between the truth and silence again. The only difference was that this time I was not the one being deceived. Brandon gave a strained laugh. "Sweetheart, you must have misunderstood. My family is complicated. Clara isn't close to us. She has always liked doing things her own way." Natalie stared at him for a long moment. "She doesn't just work at the hospital. She saved my life." Brandon swallowed. "I know, and that's amazing. But tonight is our engagement party. Let's not make everything strange." Strange, Natalie's voice dropped. "Do you think it's strange that I just realized the woman who saved me from dying is your sister, or that you hid it from me?" Brandon looked around. A few guests nearby had begun to notice. My father was still on stage, but his eyes had moved away from the crowd and settled on us. He could sense a crack spreading. "Clara," Brandon said, his voice low but sharp. "Can you please not ruin tonight?" I looked at my younger brother. For many years I had believed Brandon was simply a child who had been favored too much. But in that moment, as he stood in front of his crying fiancée, and still cared only that the party might be ruined, I realized he was not a child anymore. "I haven't said anything," I replied. Natalie asked. I answered. Natalie let go of my hand and turned fully toward Brandon. "What else have you hidden from me?" Brandon did not answer right away. And that silence was what made everything begin to change. Natalie asked the question very softly, but Brandon heard it as if he had been slapped in front of the entire room. My younger brother looked at her, then glanced around at the guests, pretending not to notice. At a few nearby tables, people had already stopped talking, and the music seemed to drift even farther away. "You're just overwhelmed," Brandon said, forcing a smile. "There are a lot of emotions tonight. I'm not hiding anything from you." Natalie looked straight at him. "Then why did you say Clara worked in administration?" "Because it wasn't important. She saved my life." "I know." Brandon's voice began to lose its patience. "But not everything needs to be brought up in front of everyone." I stood between them, suddenly feeling as if I were looking back at the dining room from when I was 18. Back then, Brandon had stayed silent, because silence benefited him. Now he was lying, because the lie kept his image intact. My phone vibrated softly in my pocket. It was a message from Dr. Kevin Chen, a colleague at Hopkins. "Clara, strange question, but is Brandon Whitman, your brother? I just saw his name on the attendee list for a pharmaceutical sales conference. I thought he was in residency." I read the message twice. It pulled the final nail out of the false wall my family had built. My father had told everyone that Brandon was about to finish medical training. Brandon had told stories about overnight shifts, difficult patients, and strict professors. He had been specific enough that no one questioned him. I opened the browser on my phone. It only took a few seconds. His professional profile appeared as clearly as a verdict. Brandon Whitman. Medical sales representative. 2 years of experience. No hospital. No residency program. No medical license. I looked up at my brother. He was still standing in front of Natalie, still trying to look like a misunderstood man, instead of someone who had finally been caught by the truth. "Brandon," I said. He turned sharply toward me. "What? When did you leave residency?" The air around us seemed to empty. Natalie froze. Brandon stared at me, his eyes widening before they darkened. "What are you talking about?" I held my phone in my hand, but I did not raise it like a weapon. I did not want to turn that moment into revenge. I simply did not want to keep protecting a lie that was hurting someone else. "Someone just messaged me," I said. I checked. "You've been working as a sales representative for a pharmaceutical company for 2 years. Natalie inhaled very softly, but the sound was sharper than breaking glass. "Brandon, tell me that isn't true." Brandon looked at her, his lips moving without sound. For a few seconds, I thought he would keep denying it. But in front of Natalie, in front of the guests, now turning their heads in front of my father coming down from the stage, Brandon had nothing left but silence. Natalie stepped back. 2 years. "Natalie, I was going to tell you." When her voice shook, "After the wedding, after I signed a mortgage with you, after I found out the man I married wasn't the man I thought he was." "I didn't want to lose you," Brandon said quickly. "Dad expected too much. I just needed more time. So you let me fall in love with a version of you that wasn't real." That sentence left Brandon silent. My father reached us at that exact moment, his face hard as stone. He gripped Brandon's shoulder, but his eyes were on me. "Clara," he said in a low voice. "That's enough. After everything, the person he wanted to stop was still me. Not the one who had lied. Not the one who had deceived his fiancée. Not the son who had burned through nearly $200,000 and hidden his failure for 2 years. I didn't make Brandon lie," I replied. "I'm just not covering for him anymore." My father clenched his jaw. "This is not the place to air family matters." Natalie turned to him. "You just spent an entire speech airing Brandon's success in front of everyone. Why does the truth have to be hidden?" My father had no answer. And for the first time, I saw the man who had spent his life deciding my worth become smaller under the weight of his own silence. The host stepped beside my father, awkward and uncertain, like a man who had just realized this elegant evening was no longer following the script. He looked as if he wanted to say something to pull the party back on track, but Natalie moved first. She wiped her tears, adjusted the shoulder of her white dress, and walked toward the stage. Natalie. Brandon called after her. "Don't do this." She did not turn back. The entire room watched her. I stood below the stage, my hands going cold, not because I was afraid for myself, but because I knew Natalie was about to lose more than a party. She was about to lose a future she had believed was real. Natalie took the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but when she looked down at Brandon, then looked over at me, that trembling turned into something painfully calm. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she said. "I know this was supposed to be an engagement party. I thought so too when I walked into this room." No one laughed. No one raised a glass. 3 years ago, I almost died in a car accident on I-95. A truck ran a red light and hit the side of my car. When I was brought to Johns Hopkins, my chest was crushed. I was bleeding internally, and my heart could barely hold on. Brandon lowered his head. My mother stood beside a flower arrangement, her eyes red. "I survived," Natalie continued, "because a surgeon operated on me for 7 hours. She told my mother that as long as there was even one chance left, she would not give up. For 3 years, I did not know how to thank that person." She looked straight at me. "Tonight I found out that person is standing in this room. Dr. Clara Whitman, Brandon's sister." The air seemed to freeze. 150 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Someone repeated my name. Someone else whispered his sister. Natalie continued more slowly now. I was told Clara only had an ordinary job at the hospital. But the truth is, she is a cardiothoracic surgeon, the woman who saved my life. My father stepped up one stair. Natalie, I think you're overwhelmed. She turned to him. No, Mr. Whitman. For the first time tonight, I am completely clear. That sentence made the room even quieter. You just called Brandon the only successful child in this family. I do not understand how a father can say that when his daughter is standing in the same room, a woman who put herself through college, through medical school, and became the person who saves people like me. A small round of applause rose from one corner of the room. Then another person joined. Then another. The applause spread slowly. It was not as loud as the applause that had followed my father's speech about Brandon, but it was heavier, more real. Natalie held the microphone toward me. Clara, do you want to say anything? I walked onto the stage. Every step felt like crossing my entire childhood. I looked down at the unfamiliar faces waiting for me to explode. But I did not want to explode. I did not come here to embarrass anyone, I said. I came because Brandon is my brother. I wanted to wish him happiness. But I will not keep pretending that I do not exist. I looked at my father. I am a doctor, whether you call me by my name or not. I paid my own tuition. I carried myself through the hardest years. I built my own life. I do not need your recognition for that to be true. My father stood frozen. My mother cried silently. Then Brandon suddenly climbed onto the stage and snatched the other microphone from the host's hand. Enough. This is my party. You always do this, Clara. You always have to prove you're better than me. I turned toward him. I don't need to prove anything. Yes, you do, he said with a bitter laugh. You left home, then came back here to play the victim. You have no idea what kind of pressure I was under. Natalie slipped the engagement ring from her finger. That single gesture made Brandon go silent. I was under pressure too, she said. But I did not lie to the person I claimed to love. She placed the ring in his palm. I cannot marry someone when I no longer know who he is. Brandon stared at the ring as if it were the last thing that still held his dignity. But it was too late. Natalie stepped down from the stage. My father did not call after her. My mother did not try to stop her. And I stood there for the first time in my life, not feeling like the one who had been left behind. I left Bethesda Country Club before the party officially ended. No one stopped me. No one knew what to say to me. The guests who had once raised their glasses to congratulate Brandon were now standing in small groups speaking in low voices, as if the entire room might collapse if they spoke any louder. My mother caught up with me near the glass doors. She no longer had her usual calm expression. Her lipstick had faded, her eyes were red, and her hand gripped her small purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Clara, she called. I stopped. Outside, the October night was colder than I had expected. Car lights reflected on the wet pavement, making everything look as if it had just survived a storm, even though it had not rained. I'm sorry, she said. I had always thought that if I ever heard those words from her, I would cry immediately. But I only stood still. Some apologies arrive too late. Not because they mean nothing, but because the person receiving them has already been forced to learn how to live without them. I know what you've accomplished, she continued. I read your research papers. I saw your name on the hospital website. I know you don't just work there. You are a good doctor. I looked at her for a long time. Then why did you never say that? She lowered her head. Because I was afraid of your father. Afraid this family would fall apart. Afraid that if I stood on your side, I would have to admit that I had left you alone for far too long. That hurt, but at least it was true. For many years, I had needed my mother to protect me. That night, all I received was the late truth of a woman who had also lived too long inside fear. I did not hug her right away. I only said, "I don't hate you. But I can't pretend this didn't leave wounds." She nodded, tears falling. "I understand." Brandon never came after me. Later, my mother told me he had driven home first, still believing I had ruined his life. Natalie texted me the next morning. Her message was very short. "Thank you for telling the truth. I'm hurt, but at least I'm not walking into a marriage built on a lie." I read that message in the hospital locker room. 10 minutes later, I walked into a 4-hour coronary artery bypass surgery. When the patient's heart began beating steadily under my hands again, I suddenly understood more clearly than ever why I had survived everything. Not so my father could pat me on the shoulder. Not so Brandon could envy me. Not so a room full of strangers could applaud me. I survived so I could become the person that 18-year-old girl had needed beside her. A week later, my father sent me a text. Just one sentence. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Years ago, I would have answered immediately. I would have run toward even the smallest chance of being acknowledged by him. But the Clara I was now was no longer the little girl standing beside the refrigerator waiting for her certificate to be displayed. I replied, "When you are ready to listen, we can talk. But I will not come just to be dismissed again." He did not answer right away. And for the first time, my father's silence did not frighten me. If this story touched you, comment, "I am worthy." Not to prove anything to anyone, but to remind yourself that you do not need someone else to see you before you begin to exist. I do not know where my family will go from here. Maybe my mother will truly change. Maybe my father will learn to see me as a whole person, not as a daughter who failed to fit his expectations. Or maybe we will simply keep enough distance to stop making each other bleed. But I know this. Forgiveness does not mean opening the door so someone can walk in and hurt you again. Boundaries are not coldness. Sometimes they are the last way we protect the gentle part of ourselves that is still left. I used to think the greatest victory of my life was becoming a heart surgeon. After that night, I understood that an even greater victory was standing before the people who had denied me and no longer asking them to recognize me. My name is Clara Whitman. I am the daughter of Richard and Elaine. I am Brandon's sister. But more than anything, I am the woman who saved herself. And from now on, no one in that family gets to tell the story of my life as if I never existed.